So, Isaac, why don't you tell our audience just a moment about yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Isaac, managing partner at Monceau CPA, US, Canadian, French tax accounting firm with offices mainly in France, in the US, and in Canada. And we are here to serve clients internationally, uh, primarily from the US and Canada, living in France or still living in those home countries. And we assist them with all their tax and accounting obligations, whether in France or in their home countries.
Brilliant. And by the way, Isaac does our work, so uh, he has our endorsement. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in with the questions because these are things that I know people who are watching our videos are going to want to know about. Many of them considering moving to France. So let's just start because there's 5 categories that people want to know about. One is, what about the right to work and earn money in France? What about paying your taxes as an expat? What about banking and transferring money to France, investing in France, whether you're living abroad or here as an expat, managing your inheritance tax as a foreigner or expat. So these are kind of the categories where we get questions. And I know we're not going to probably hit all of those, but just those are the main things. So I put 12 questions together.
All right. Now, just as a disclaimer, some of the information are not necessarily per se my area of expertise. However, given that I'm a deputy mayor in France, that I'm a
Mhm.
sworn-in translator, a U.S. notary public, and I do a lot of things as well, most of those questions I will be able to provide you the information that are beyond the tax and accounting scope.
Yes, and that's part of what I'm thinking. It's you're not going to give me expertise about those subjects, but how they relate to the money in France. So I just um, does it make a difference what kind of visa someone has if they're earning and paying tax here? Does it make any difference at all, or is that a question for someone else?
Right. So this is, I'm going to answer that, and a lot of those immigration-oriented questions should be addressed to an immigration
Mhm.
lawyer that I could recommend to you guys. But it is important to understand that any country, such as the U.S. or France, if you intend to permanently live in France, which is more than 12 months, you have to have the right to be in that country. And that usually is the tourist visa, or some of the countries like the US are exonerated from any visa if they come here on a short-term period in France. However, if you intend to work in France, then there are two options. The immigration lawyer will tell you that if you work for a US entity, which means remotely, there will not be any problem. But the immigration lawyer will look at the immigration perspective. Why? Because you come in France as a tourist, you're not necessarily working for a French company, and then you're working remotely, you're fine. But that is immigration. And unfortunately, we all know that immigration limits ourselves to the border of the country, but tax is supersedes that. And for tax, we have a complete different approach. The tax notion in France is around the notion of territoriality. So if you physically live in France and work from France, which is emails, Teams, Zoom, phone calls, or anything like that, you are indeed working. And that ultimately has consequence of two things. One, your company or your activity must be registered in France. Second, you must be paying taxes in France. And that's the problem that we have with visa. If you come with a visa in France that is a tourist visa, you cannot work. And if you cannot work, you theoretically cannot work even remotely. So that's always what I tell my clients. Think about what you're going to be doing in France. If you are going to indeed work more than just occasional work, you might very well be eligible to the passport talent visas, which is one of the visas that will allow you to work in France. Ultimately, you need to show 50,000, 5,000 euros a year of sales, which can be easily, reasonably achieved. And that will allow you not only to move to France more permanently on the path to permanent card or citizenship, but also will allow you to be completely tax compliant.
Got it. That's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to know. And so you already answered my second question is, does the type of visa affect the tax that you pay? So I think that you've addressed that one. If
Well, I just
I,
want to point out that I want to point that very important to understand that once you enter France, legally with a tourist visa or working visa, you are supposed, and it's very important to lodge a tax return on a yearly basis. There are no minimum requirement thresholds that we have in the US, in France. Even if you have no income, whether from France or from abroad, you have to lodge a tax return, even if you're here on long stay tourist. So if you work in France, obviously you'll pay taxes. I can't tell you how much taxes you will pay, but the tax rate does not differentiate based on the type of visa that you have while you come in France. The most important thing is to have a proper visa to be able to fully work.
Brilliant. And you've addressed one of my later questions. If I'm living here and I just have passive income from my retirement account or other passive income, do I still have to file taxes in France?
Right. So I partially am sorry for going to disorder, but everything
Hmm?
is connected one to the other. As I said, anybody permanently residing in France should file a tax return in France, even though he has no income from France or even no income from the US or passive income only, should always file a tax return in France to present not only what he has potentially earned in France, but also abroad. We have the same system in the US where you have to disclose what you're earning outside of France, outside of the US. So the same thing applies to France. I might need to jump on to the next question, which is what will be then the tax consequences of me disclosing this income from abroad, whether it's active or passive? Well, as you know, declaring does not mean paying. Very important golden rule. To declare is a compliant requirement that could lead you to penalty should you fail on honoring that principle. Taxing or having to pay on those revenues all depends on the type of revenue and the tax treaty that France signed with the other countries. Since we're targeting here US clients, you have to know that the US tax treaty, which is income tax treaty, or donation and inheritance treaty, is one of the most beneficial and generous among the 125 tax treaty that France signed. So that means if you come to France, bottom line, if you already paid in the US whatever you had to pay, you will not pay again in France. But as we said, you will have to declare that.
So you will file both in France and the US, but you'll only pay tax one time in one country or the other, depending on the income that you have.
Correct. And that's the whole purpose of the double tax agreement, to prevent you to pay twice. Unfortunately, I see lots of handholders or so-called professionals in France that do not understand how to interpret this tax treaty and how to declare that to the tax authorities, that also, by the way, do not understand fully everything, because the tax authorities are not designed to address international income. So at the first level, when we go to the regional center, then they know more. So sometimes I even get clients that get taxed supposedly on income earned in the US because they haven't filed properly, or they have failed to properly respond to the French tax authorities. And that's where we come into play by telling and explaining not only on the tax return we submit to the authorities by putting them already a disclosure of referencing which article of the tax treaty we're mentioning based on the income we're presenting in the tax return. But in case of litigation, which is we get a tax bill that is incorrect, we fight, and in 99% of the time we prevail, and then the customer gets his money back.
That's awesome, because I've heard horror stories from people who wound up paying tax twice because they didn't know, they didn't file. They worked with somebody who, knew some of the details and not all of them. Is one of the things that I like about working with you. You have an office in Florida, which is my hometown or my home state, but also here. So I know that you understand the different nuances of, what it is to work in the US and with state income taxes in other states and whatnot, so that your clients don't pay twice. And if they do get in some kind of a crazy situation, you know how to advocate for them. So that's
Right.
that's a
And
beautiful
thank
thing.
you for that. But I just want to remind everyone's here, the audience, there's a lot of cliche about France, about the tax exposure. Yes, it's a
Mhm.
small country. Yes, everybody's supposed to pay taxes at some point, right? and it's normal if you live in a new country. But the taxes here are way more reasonable than some of the states that we have in the US. Remember, in the US, we have three tiers: federal, state, and local, whereas in France, we only have one level, which is the federal or the countryside level. And with the good help of accountant, hopefully us, you can always optimize that and certainly avoid having to be taxed twice and understand the laws and how they work so that you can fully enjoy living in France.
Yes, and one of the other things that I can say about paying taxes in France is the return on your investment is very different than it is in the US because you're getting a lot of social services and benefits that hit directly on your out-of-pocket expenses, with the medical and different levels of education and cultural things and whatnot. So there's a lot of benefits, even though it may seem like the taxes are high. They may be high, especially for a place like Florida with no state income tax. But even if you are paying more tax, then you have a lot more benefit that goes with it. So
Right.
it's a different cost of
Right.
living because of that.
And one thing you need to remind the audience here, if you are 60, 70, enjoying retirement, which is great, you have a problem medically speaking, any problem. And we know, unfortunately, with COVID and anything, that anything can happen, unfortunately. You walk into a hospital in France, they cannot reject you.
Mhm.
Whether you have Social Security, whether you speak French or not, whether I can't vouch that they will be treating you immediately because we are still in the ER department, and I think worldwide there's always a delay into processing ER patients. But fortunately for you guys, they will not ask you, as we in the US do, your credit card before even talking to you, and that's important for those that are thinking, despite the chaos, politically speaking, that is or will happen in the US in the next few months. It is important, as you intend to live in France, to enjoy the life here, lifestyles besides the baguette and the croissant. You also understand that, medically speaking, you have a very solid system that will protect you.
That's very true. Very true. Okay. Let me find the next one. This is one that surprised me when we moved here. In the US, people assume that they have a right to go and open a bank account just because you walk into the bank and say, I have money, open account and deposit money in the bank. Are there things that, what are the rules about opening a bank account, or is that something I should ask a different professional?
So I'll tell you what people don't. Even though I have a political hat, some I'm going to be open heart with you guys. First of all, anybody that resides legally in France has, if you live in France with the proper authorization, which is a long stay visa or a working visa, you should be able to walk into any bank and open up a bank account. And again, it's not because you don't speak French, you should be getting a refusal. However, you have to understand that the IRS, with the FATCA rules, has a lot of the banks worldwide. What I mean by terrorize is they have not created an obligation for all of the French bank holders or bankers, but not only France, to have the obligation to disclose, upon questioning from the IRS or not, the existence and the balances of account holders. And that created a whole new massive amount of work for existing clients. Why? Because let's say I'm a US citizen, but I've been living in France for 40 years. The bank doesn't know me as a US citizen unless I told them so. If I was born in the US, they could see my passport. If I wasn't born in the US like me, but became a citizen later, they wouldn't know, right? Now, because the IRS has mandated them to protect so and do so, they have to kind of investigate with all of their existing new customers to make sure they file the W-9 forms, which tells the bank, according to the IRS, if they are a US person. I must remind you, a US person is US citizen, green card holder, or valid US visa. So that created a whole new set of obligations that bankers are annoyed with. And so as a shortcut, a lot of banks, non-officially, but have decided to kind of refuse gently the American clients for that matter. Obviously, I'm not talking about the client that comes with millions, that I'm sure the bank will find ways to be compliant. But I'm talking about the general guy, okay? And you have to understand that this is completely illegal. And myself, I had to fight for on behalf of some of my customers to go to the Banque de France, which is the official French national bank, and to file a complaint. And the Bank of France told my local bank, hey, you must open a bank account for that person. And we prevailed. But if you know already the speech, you know already about it, whenever you walk into a bank, if you get excuses, then you know that either you need to fight for it or you have to call Isaac.
That's good to know. I've opened a couple of bank accounts since I've been in France, and it has been an adventure and taken many appointments to get it done. But I'm glad to hear you say that. It would have saved me trouble if I had met you sooner. That's good to know. Another question. What is the best way, if I'm an expat moving to France, what is the best way for me to move a large amount of money here just to live on or to buy something? Is there a limit to what I can bring? Can I just, open a bank account here and wire money from my account in the US? Or is there any rule or any something about bringing large sums of money from the US to France?
Right. So first of all, when you transfer money from one point to another, whether you are in the US, within the US, or anywhere else, the question is legitimate on the table. Is this money a kosher money, right? Is this legal? Where the money comes from? I would say 99% of the time, if it's in your bank account, the money has already been taxed or subject to tax. So we're talking about money that is post-tax that you've earned over your life and you have in your bank account. So theoretically, there shouldn't be any problem. But when you transfer it from the US to France, the banker, the notaire, the lawyer, the accountant, everybody, the tax authorities have the right to ask you to justify the origin of this money. So how do you do that? Well, you go to an accountant like us, or a lawyer, or anybody else that is fully literate to understand where the money comes from, which is be able to read your US tax return to understand that this money comes from your investment, from your brokerage accounts, from a house you sold, with all the paper trail, and be able to write an affidavit, a statement that will kind of say, hey, with the oath I've taken as a professional, I can vouch that the money transferred is completely compliant and has been subject to tax in the US and is not money laundering. Those are usually the terms we use, and that money is kind of safe. Now, why I tell you guys to do that, whether you're being asked to do so or not, because when you transfer money from the US to France, maybe the bank will ask you a justification proof, maybe they will not. What does that mean? That means if they receive money from abroad, they can easily report that money to TRACFIN, which is a special institution in France that trace international wire transfers from the government, and start an audit on you without even telling you. So in order to avoid being in the tracker or in the in the eye of the authorities or third parties, make sure that you inform your banker by providing these statements, so that the statements will be added to the wire transfer details, so that no matter what, who kind of questions about nature and the origin of the fund, they know that it's 100% compliant.
Thank you. That's something I want to know. Oh, and I asked, are there limits? Are there limits to how much you can send?
There are not limits, but obviously the more you transfer, the more this question I was telling you about are going to be raised. So whether you transfer 10K or 1 million, I believe you should be, preparing those type of attestation or statements or affidavit that you can share that to your bank to avoid having the money, because the risk is the money being frozen, to be put on hold until you justify it. And by the time you justify it, maybe 3 months have passed, and we don't want that.
And maybe your whole account and not just the funds you're trying to move.
Right.
So
If,
that's,
if they're suspicious, and we're talking
yeah.
about multi-million transfer because you're buying a beautiful house on the French Riviera, obviously you don't want to hold your deals and the transfer to the notaire and everything else because of a ridiculous document that you failed to provide ahead of.
Which brings us to the next question. Are there special things that I have to do or report if I want to invite to buy a property or make some investments in France? Is there anything special that I need to do other than this affidavit you're talking about?
Well, you know, France has been one of the countries, especially over the last few years, that are putting a lot of incentives to bring foreign investors in France to invest here, whether in operations or real estate. So obviously, the real estate market is really hot, and everyone knows about it, and especially now that the rates are still a bit high. I have a lot of clients from abroad that have spare money that are coming here in France and getting great deals because regular French people cannot get loans easily because the interest rates have gone up. So it's a great return on investments, potential investment to look for. There's nothing, you know, more than just talking to your accountant or lawyer because you want to know which structure, which vehicle you're going to be buying the property through in order to optimize your tax system. For example, if people are coming to France and they are 70 years old and they're coming for retirement, I will highly tell them do not buy what will be your primary residence in France under your personal name. I will tell you buy it under an SCI, which is a special corporate structure for real estate investments property. But you're going to tell me, hey, but it's my primary home. It's not about inheritance. If your kids and your heirs are all in the US, because you bought the house under your personal name, these assets will be directly subject to the high tax rate that we have in France for inheritance. Must remind the audience that the tax rate for inheritance start 5%. So
How
if
many
you buy an
percent? You
asset
froze
that
for a minute. Can you tell me again the percent?
5 to 55%,
Okay.
that could potentially be heavy taxes for upon you passing for your kids to pay for an asset that they don't even see because it's located away from home from the US to France. Whereas there are solutions. If you buy an SCI, it's no longer you owning the house, it's the company owning the house, and you own the shares of the house. And what is the difference? The tax treaty between France when it comes to donation and inheritance makes a difference. If you buy the house under your personal name, it's a physical asset. But if we're talking about shares of a company, then those can be easily transferred and taxed with the US system and not the French system. So you're essentially avoiding the tax treatment, the heavy tax treatment on your primary home property, as opposed to if you buy it under your personal name. So those are the things that are
That's
worth having a conversation with before, because I could make you save millions into tax bill.
that's brilliant. That's worth gold right there, what you just said. One of the questions that I asked that I was going to ask earlier, if you want to start a company or buy a company in France as a foreigner, like how does that work? You know, we talked about the right to work here, but if I'm living in the US and I want to invest in a business, do I do that again as an individual, or do I do that through a company here? And if I want to start a company, like what kind of rules? Like if I'm not working for someone, if I want to work for myself here.
Right. So we have two options. Option A is the individual lives in the US and does not reside in France.
Mhm.
Option two is the person is or will be living in France. So let's talk about option one. Option one, you cannot open a French company if you don't reside in France.
Okay.
However, if you have a US company that is looking to develop and open a branch or company in the US in France that will be owned by the US entity, you're allowed to do so, and we can assist you with these things, and no problem. It takes a bit of time, but that's fine. The second option is the most typical. Someone comes to France or is about to come to France, has a practice in the US, is basically looking to transfer that practice, either by getting a visa for it, because he's telling the visa authorities, hey, I have a good business in the US. I'm intending to do the same business in France, so I have to open up a business. Based on that, by the way, the passport talent can be requested, because you can ask, by showing the business plan, what is the business outcome and how it's going to be developing in France, and the taxes you will have to pay in France, and so on and so on. And based on that, they grant you a visa, right? But essentially, if you will be a French tax resident, opening up a business in France is pretty easy through a professional. Takes about 2 weeks, usually costs about $1,000 to open up the. And then once you open the business, you thereafter have to pay an accountant to take care of your monthly bills and taxes and sales tax. It's not like in the US where you can do QuickBooks and everything on your own, and then come to the accountant at year end and sometimes do it yourself. In France, the accounting and tax world is very normalized, and you have to work through an accountant who uses professional software to face potential tax audit. In any way, my ultimate suggestion is make sure you take the time to consult with, again, an accountant or a tax lawyer ahead of your departure from the US to France, to ensure you understand about the system, which is not that completely different than the US, but still, there are particularities that we have in France that we don't have in the US, and vice versa. And it's important, so which corporate structure you're looking to put your eggs in, to understand what you're stepping in and the potential social charges and taxes you will face in due course.
There's also a distinction in France called the auto entrepreneur. And I understand that the auto entrepreneur, it would sound to, my American ears as, yeah, I'm just self-employed. In Florida, I can open a business that the description of what I do is any and all legal business. That's not true in France. So if I'm in France, I have to tell you exactly what I do, how I get my money. Everything is very particular. And in the case of the auto entrepreneur, there's a cap on how much I'm allowed to earn. Is that correct?
Right. So the US is very known to be a liberal country, right? Free trade, supposedly, right? Free trade, free everything, right? Even sugar-free, whatever it is, no problem, right? But in France, it doesn't really work like that. You have to be in categories. So you're either an employee with a pay stub, you're either an entrepreneur, right? And we'll talk about what type of status, or you're unemployed, or you're retired, right? Those are the categories, okay? So if you're employed, I'm not going to talk about that. If you're retired, I'm not going to talk about that. Or if you're retired, if you're unemployed, I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about is what type of independent status I could open up. There are 3 statuses: auto-entrepreneur, SAS SASU, and EURL SARL. Now, auto-entrepreneur is the easy status. It's like a sole proprietorship we have in the US, okay? It's limited to 77,000 a year. You can face VAT, but I won't talk about VAT now because it's very technical. But just for you to know that if you're trading with outside of France, with your clients being outside of France, there is no VAT, okay? But again, 77,000 euros limited to that auto-entrepreneur, which is also known as micro-enterprise status. And you don't need an accountant. You can do it yourself. You have quarterly declaration to done online. You pay 23% flat social taxes every quarter based on your gross sales. And that's it. When comes income tax return, you put in the amount of money you made during the year. You get a 50% abatement allowance of how much you made. And on the remaining 50%, the tax are being calculated. So it's a very good status to start off because it gives you access to the social security system. You are in France, you have a social security number and everything. But one big drawback, or 2 of them: 1, you're not really treated or considered as a real company, right? You are like a second tier type of company. And second, you're not allowed to write off any expenses. So you're paying social charges to about 23% based on gross revenue sales you generated, which is kind of a bummer because you may have rent, you may have an accountant, you may have trips, you may have meals and entertainment, you may have a lot. And that's why I tell my clients, unless you're really not sure of where you're headed, and that's why you can keep the auto-entrepreneur, I would highly advise you not to touch auto-entrepreneur because it doesn't really tax efficient help you out. By having a real company such as SAS or SASU or URL and SIRL, you can ultimately perhaps pay less taxes because you are entitled to offset any expenses that you have. You're going to tell me, but I don't have that much expenses. But you do. You don't even know about it. When you visit the US to work, when you have the phone bill, have the meals and entertainment, the taxi, the accountant, the office. Oh, but I'm not having an office. I'm working from home. Hey, but let me tell you, 30% of your rent can be offset by your work expenses. So that's quite a lot. And I'm sure if you do the math and comparison, you ultimately is more on working with a company style than the auto-entrepreneur style. But that also what we do as part of the conversation we have when we do a consultation with the client. Going back to the other two structures, I'm not going to detail here the differences between SAS and SASU, which are together, or URL and SIRL. But just for you to know, they operate those two statuses, SAS or SASU1, URL or SIRL, they operate the same way, which is like we have in the US, sales minus expenses equals net income. And then you're facing your corporate tax, unless you've elected and opted to be treated as a pass-through entity and being taxed personally. This is called income tax. It's only available for the first 5 years in France. But again, those are the discussions we need to have during the consultation.
Awesome. I think that's this is all just important information to know. I appreciate you taking time to explain all of this because we do have a lot of people who are thinking about, talking about, moving to France, and a lot of them don't know all of the nuances that there are to make the change, and there are surprises that, bad surprises that they can avoid by, listening to this video and taking on the kind of services that you provide. So I appreciate you taking the time.
And thank you for interviewing me on this, but I always use this analogy. If you have a problem with your head, you don't go to see a foot doctor, right? You have to go to the person that understand the topics. And I'm not the only accountant that understand both sides of the ocean, but we are very few in France that are doing such a work. So whether they come to me or anybody else, I highly invite the audience to make sure they are fully assisted with the proper professionals around them. And when I mean professional, I mean licensed professionals, not always handholders or people that don't necessarily always know the reality, that are with insurance and credentials and so on. And also important, don't call them or don't contact them once you already made the move or got your visa granted. Make sure beforehand you're taking the time to consult. And I'll finish with that example. If you have a house in the US and you sell your house prior to arrival in France, and you didn't consult with a proper professional, you may end up paying taxes in France on the capital gains that you generated in the US. But if you do the proper consultation and you know what are the cutoff and what are the rules and how you need to know, whatever you did prior to you move in France will not have any impact tax-wise in France. And that's just to give you a perspective on how prepared not only to you move, but tax-wise you should be when you come to France. And that's also why we're here to help your clients.
That is amazing. I'm so glad that you added that. I would never have thought to consult with an expert in the French-American system before selling my home. That's gold. That's absolute gold. Yep. This is why we call the head doctor instead of the foot doctor, as you said.
That's exactly right.
In France, they, with the visa and all of the experience, they say, now you are bien installé, like you're well installed, and being well installed in France starts long before you arrive in France.
And more importantly, the Americans have to be patient because in France, nothing gets done overnight, nothing. But that's also the French way of life. We do take lunch breaks. We do go out for lunch. We do not work 65 hours a week. We do have 5 weeks vacation. You do know that in August, nobody works in France. There's a lot of things that people need to understand, which also contributes to the good way of life that we have in France. Yeah. To good or to bad, it depends on how you look at it. But you have to understand this perspective to be fully patient. For example, getting a social security number will not get yourself when you walk into the Social Security Administration office in Paris. You have to wait 3 months, for example, to even place a request. And probably after the 3 months, you have to wait 6 months because nobody's going to understand your request or where you're coming from.
And you might get the paperwork that your visa is valid and it was valid since 6 months ago or 4 months ago before you actually receive it. Yeah.
Retract. So again, being assisted allow you not only to make the right choices, but also help you understand and be more prepared to face this new adventure. And last but not least, France is also a country with a lot of bureaucracy. We love paperwork. We love sometimes letter with nothing in there, right? Bogus letters, right? You just have to know about those things again and not be scared and not be concerned. It's an admin work. It's okay. They won't. I know people tell me, oh, I didn't pay my taxes or I didn't file this. They're gonna kick me out of the country. Nobody will kick you out of the country. You have to be compliant, that's for sure, regardless you live in France or in the US. But you also have to understand that France is perhaps less aggressive when it comes to those things. But once again, you have to be assisted with the proper professionals.
Yeah. Either be compliant or get compliant. It's
Yeah. They passed a law recently in France that it's funny because it's called droit à l'erreur. You have the right to be wrong.
I
And
love it.
it's okay, right? So if you get a tax audit and you show good faith, obviously I'm not talking about intentional negligence, so on. But general good faith, you didn't know and so on. Well, it's okay. You have the droit à l'erreur. But at the same time, nobody's supposed to ignore the law. So make sure you are educated and properly assisted.
Brilliant. Isaac, thank you for your time today. I appreciate you. I appreciate the knowledge you're sharing with our viewers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care, Colleen.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye-bye.